Hi, my name's Jojo Mehta and I'm co-founder of the international campaign to stop Ecocide. Ecocide is the mass damage and destruction of ecosystems, committed with knowledge of the risks. And right now, it's not a crime. There are very few places in the world where this word is used in the criminal code. And our campaign has been going since 2017 to promote this concept and to bring it forward at the international level, at the International Criminal Court, to make it a crime across the world. And it's a campaign that is beginning to gather momentum, but many people still don't understand what ecocide refers to and how it will potentially work. So right now, for example, the basic human right that we all have is the right to life. We all have a right to life. And yet, what protects that right to life is actually a criminal law, the law of murder. Because murder is a crime, we cannot take the life of another person. But the natural world, the ecosystems on which we all depend and of which we are a part, we're not separate from, do not have, in many cases do not have those rights, and they do not have that protection. So can you imagine campaigning for social justice or human rights if torture and mass killing were permitted? Because that is the situation with nature and with the environment. There is not that fundamental law, that fundamental sense, moral sense even, that damaging the earth is unacceptable. And in our dominant Western culture, we use criminal law to draw that moral line. So if we're to shift the understanding of what it is acceptable and not acceptable to do, it is very important that ecocide, that mass damage of ecosystems, becomes criminal. And there's a very key reason why we approach this at the international level. There are a number of reasons. Some may seem quite obvious. The biggest polluters of the environment, the biggest companies behind the deforestation, the overfishing, all of these activities that are destroying nature and also exacerbating climate change, they're all transnational companies. They're all multinational companies. So while of course we would support anyone that wanted their own jurisdiction, their own country to criminalize ecocide, we feel it's fundamentally important to approach this at the international level so that the perpetrators of these activities are not being chased from one jurisdiction to another, but there is coherence created across boundaries. And the International Criminal Court is very important in this regard because it's the only mechanism in the world, it's the only forum where there is direct access to the criminal justice systems that already exist in all the countries in all the member states. So when something is made a crime at the international level, at the International Criminal Court, any country, any member state that ratifies that crime must introduce that crime into their own criminal legislation within a year. So that means that you are accessing already existing systems. So you don't need to introduce a new tribunal, a new international court, establish a whole new treaty or convention. You simply amend the document that governs the International Criminal Court, which is called the Rome Statute. And right now, that statute has 4 crimes on it: war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and more recently, crimes of aggression. So we know that that document can be amended. It has been amended in the past. There is a specific procedure for it. And we can add the crime of ecocide, and it will become a 5th crime. And the Rome Statute covers the crimes that are considered of most serious concern to humanity as a whole. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of anything more serious than the collapse of ecosystems that is happening right now. We're looking at the 6th mass extinction, including ourselves. And so this is, if anything is of most serious concern to humanity as a whole, it is ecocide right now. And so that's why we aim for the International Criminal Court. We also do this because Many governments find it scary to adopt a law like this when they have lots of established economic relationships. It's something that I'm sure that Fridays for Future movement and environmental activists the world over find hugely frustrating. And you know, how politicians find it really hard to actually move forward with these things, no matter what fine words they say, because there are all these established relationships. And yet supporting criminalizing ecocide at the international level is something that governments find less of a risk, because it's something that has to happen at the international level. You need a whole number of countries for it to move forward, so it doesn't feel so scary. And when it happens, it will be in the company of many other countries. And so we also see this for that reason. We also see this as a very efficient way to insert a boundary that, you know, we are crying out for in the world, to actually curb the dangerous industrial activity that our corporations are engaging in. And so there are several reasons why to approach this at the international level is very important. I'll just give a very short explanation of how this works in terms of how can this actually be made into a crime. So there are 4 stages to the process. The first stage is a state, any state, must propose it at the International Criminal Court. They have to submit that as a proposal to amend to include that crime. And the beauty of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is that it is a one state, one vote situation, which is like the UN, but there is a difference, because at the ICC there is no veto. There is no Security Council with a few big countries on it that can say, no, we don't want to do this. At the ICC, any state can propose it, from a small island state, which are some of the most climate vulnerable, and they're the ones that have actually put it back on the table there. They've actually announced, we'd like this to be seriously considered. So it can be a small state, it can be a big state, it can be a group of states, but that proposal has to happen. The next stage is that at the next annual assembly of the ICC, a simple majority will put that amendment on the table for discussion. So that's the second stage. And that's the stage we're working on. We're working with a number of states to reach the point of proposal and gathering support internationally for that second stage. The third stage is the key one. It's the adoption stage, and that can take some time and may take a special dedicated conference with the states that are interested to all talk about it and get the exact text finished and ready. And then what we want to come out of that stage with is a 2/3 majority of members of the ICC. Now, the ICC at the moment has 123 member states. There are more joining, and we know that at least one joined last year specifically because of discussion around this crime. But 2/3 of those states need to agree for the crime to go into the statute. Once that has happened, that crime exists. That crime is on the books, and already that has power, because there is a legal principle that you may have heard of called universal jurisdiction. And some countries already operate this principle. Belgium is one, and Belgium has also, in their new government, actually written in that they intend to investigate and take diplomatic action to halt ecocide crime. And what universal jurisdiction means is that anyone in the world that, in this case, for example, Belgium believes to be committing ecocide, if they set foot in Belgium, they can be arrested. And that happens as soon as the crime exists. That possibility happens as soon as the crime exists. So from any country that does ratify it can apply that principle, even if the perpetrator doesn't come from their country. So it's quite powerful, even for countries that may not be members yet of the ICC. And then once countries begin to ratify, that is stage 4, that is ratification, and that is when the crime comes into effect in every country that ratifies it. And that can happen over time. But as I said, there's no veto. So once that is on the table, there is no country that can say, stop, this isn't happening. It's an accumulation, which is now beginning to happen. So this particular route to protecting the natural world is probably the simplest and most efficient route to making an enforceable deterrent. Now, the next question that people mostly ask is, well, who would it apply to? Because obviously in a number of arenas we could all be guilty of contributing to the ecocides that we're seeing. You know, am I committing ecocide by driving my car? You know, am I committing is it ecocide if the trees on my village green get cut down? Well, the simple answer to that is no. We are talking about large-scale damage and destruction. We're aiming at the biggest perpetrators because their portion of what happens in the world is much, much higher than any individual contribution. But also because it functions like the other atrocity crimes, which are already criminalized at the international level. So, for example, for the crime of genocide, you don't prosecute the foot soldiers. You prosecute those who are the controlling minds, the directors of what is happening. So with the case of ecocide, that could be CEOs, that could be financiers, that could be government ministers issuing permits, that kind of thing. So it would be the people who actually are in the positions of responsibility and effectively should know better. Because unlike the other crimes that are already listed at that level, ecocide is not a crime of direct intention. Obviously, if you are an industrial livestock farmer and you are burning down the rainforest to breed cattle, your primary objective isn't destroying the rainforest, your primary objective is making money, but you know that by doing what you're doing, you are destroying the rainforest. And therefore the level of intent comes in at knowledge. It comes in the fact that nowadays, even just over the last few years, the awareness of the effects of these activities has become so widespread, and we have documents like the Paris Agreement that everybody has agreed to say we know that A will lead to B. And so those people making those decisions understand the decisions that they're making, and yet they're making them anyway. And so that becomes the crime. That you knew what the result was going to be, and you took this action anyway. Now, there's another aspect to this that is very powerful and important to know about. And that is that while I come from an environmental activist background. I got involved in all of this through the anti-fracking community in the UK. That's how I came to this work. And from my perspective, and I'm sure from many environmental activists and defenders' perspectives, there are a number of CEOs of big companies that we would love to see in court, of course. But when it comes down to it, that's actually not the point of what we're doing. Right now, most environmental laws and regulations, not all but most, are in the civil arena. They're about how much of a toxin you're allowed to release before it becomes a problem. Those kinds of details, and they're often very detailed and very technical. And companies spend a lot of money and a lot of expensive lawyers working around those rules. And they know that if regulation changes, they don't really have to change their behavior. They only have to change their budget, because they may be taken to court, they may be fined. And of course that's very expensive for anybody wanting to do that. To sue, if a community wants to sue a destructive company for negligence or damage or any of these things, it's expensive, it's difficult, it takes years. And the companies will do everything they can to make sure that those cases are not successful. And even if they are, the companies will be paying fines. Now, criminal law is completely different. Criminal law means jail sentences. Criminal law has a genuinely deterrent factor in the sense that once this crime is in place, in theory, you're not going to be, let me give you an example. If somebody beats you up on the street, you don't sue them, you go to a policeman and you say, this person hurt me, and then the state prosecutes. That is what will happen when ecocide is a crime. And so it's not a question of how much money do you have, can you take this person to court? You're simply going to report it. And those people in those positions of power will be then potentially criminally liable. Now, what that means is that as soon as this crime is on the agenda, as soon as it's on the horizon, and actually it's kind of already on the horizon, but as soon as a state actually proposes it, you're then looking at not an if scenario, but a when scenario for when this comes in. And what that means is that the CEOs, but even further back in the production chain, the investors, the insurers, the financiers, they will all see this coming. And they will have to adjust their practices because they will know that within a certain number of years, it may not be exact how long they know it's going to take, but that it's coming. And so that period of the procedure of putting it in place, it may take 3 years, it may take 5 years. But in the scale of what we're looking at, that's a very short time to change in international law. And it's a short time to change corporate practice. But we also know that when the rules are there, corporations can move very, very fast. And so when this is on the horizon and approaching, that becomes a kind of a compliance period. A bit like when the data protection rules came in. You probably remember, every company knew that within this length of time they would have to comply with those rules, and they had to apply their minds and their policies to actually adjusting their practices to fit that. And that is what can happen also with ecocide crime. So even before it's in place, in fact, particularly before it's in place, it has huge power to start changing the direction of how corporations behave. So that was a bit of a brief whistle-stop tour, as we say in the UK, of how this crime could work. I'm really happy to take any questions that you may have about it. But it's a real privilege to be here in Stockholm and speaking with you all, so I'm so excited about that. And thank you for listening.